technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. We're going to spend some time talking about the next generation, and I'll hold up our booklet that we produced a while back and actually talked about a biblical point of view on the next generation. You will notice that one of the books we recommend is a book by Thom Rainer and Jeff Rainer, which is called Millennials, and I'll hold that one up because a number of years ago we had both of them on Point of View to talk about millennials, and as a matter of fact, one of the reasons we have a Millennial Roundtable, by the way, that will be taking place tomorrow, is due to some of the things that he has written in that book. Well, he has a new book coming out. It is coming out in August, so you can pre-order it right now. The Anxious Generation Goes to Church. And if that sounds familiar, let me hold up another book. This is the one by Jonathan Haidt, who's been on the program with us before as we talked about his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. This book on the anxious generation, I think, is, again, an illustration of the fact that we certainly need to understand more, not only about Generation Y, the millennial generation, but now Generation Z. And so we welcome back to the microphone Thom Rainer. He's the founder and CEO of Church Answers. He's a former pastor, best-selling author, 42 books in print, individual, graduated from the University of Alabama, earned his Master of Divinity and PhD degrees from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And Thom, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Always good to be with you.
You talk about the fact that you were kind of writing and then came across the book by Jonathan Haidt, which is called The Anxious Generation, hence the title of your book. But again, there has always been a desire on your part for us to understand more about the merging generations. And of course, you're best known for us around here, having written that book on the millennials. But now this new one really helps us understand Generation Z.
Well, I was about to write another book, at least I thought I was, and I came across some type of promo on the Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and I said, that sounds fascinating. So I ordered it on Amazon, and lo and behold, Amazon had it to me that same day. I stayed up till the wee hours of the morning reading it, took somewhat of a short nap, and finished it the next day completely, and I was totally mesmerized. You've had Jonathan Haidt on your radio show, if I just heard correctly, which is absolutely amazing. And you know that he's an agnostic Jew. And this was an agnostic Jew that was primarily saying we've got to do something for this generation. And at least implicitly, probably not explicitly, but implicitly the book was saying they need something. And that something, I think, is very well connected to faith in Christ specifically and generally the church. So I put down what I was doing, and I called up my publisher at Tyndale, and I just said, what do you think? A couple of days later, they got back and said, it's a go. I should not have done that because I got into so much research. I know I was over my head at times. I had to get a lot of answers, but when it was all said and done, we produced the book. I produced the book called The Anxious Generation Goes to Church with no apologies for copying the title straight from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Well, again, we'll get into why they are anxious in just a minute, but you are always very good at helping us kind of break down the different groups, and whether you talk about the builder generation or the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, which are millennials, Gen Z, just give us at least a little bit of an overview, because if we're talking about the younger generations, which is the subtitle of your book, I think you're really talking about both Y, Z, and maybe even a little bit into Alpha. Can you explain?
Gen Z is the major one that we were looking at. When Haidt did his book, most of his focus was on Gen Z, even though he said my book is not a Gen Z book. But most of Gen Z had by this time gone through the period of adolescence, and their minds had been shaped, or we could say misshaped, by some of the things we talk about in the book. And so you got Gen Z. I call them the first anxious generation, born between 1997 and 2012. A little bit different from the lines that I had when I did the millennials. Jess and I ended the millennials at 2000. Obviously, this has the millennials ending earlier, but it's only a few years difference. But 1997 to 2012 was Gen Z, and then along comes Gen Alpha beginning in 2013.
Yes.
And they, right now, are in that shaping part of time in their lives.
Well, let's see if we can talk about some of the anxiety, but I'll hold up one other book and then I'll stop holding up books. And this is a book by Jean Twenge, I, Gen. And that was the argument that she made, and of course the argument that Jonathan Haidt made. What we're talking about with this younger generation is they are digital natives. You and I can remember a time when we actually read things and even probably wrote things on a typewriter, not a computer. We can certainly remember a time when there was not an internet, and of course there are even of Generation Y, those who've been part of the internet. But then you get to the issue of social media, and that's the argument that is being made. Jean Twenge talking about just as sort of a digital generation, but Jonathan Haidt and others saying that has completely rewired their childhood, and that's the argument you make in your book.
I think it's a powerful argument by Haidt and others, and that is another excellent book that you pointed out. And that is, there's been a rewiring. You know, what happens to young generations in adolescence right now, where they're glued to a screen, usually the smartphone, and there are really four things that are going on. Number one, the internet. Number two, the smartphone. Number three, the fact that now you can get social media on the smartphone. And number four, the polarization of society, which is not helping any. You put all those four, and their minds are being shaped by something you and I could not have imagined. And let me just say, I'm old enough that I can tell you I wrote my first 5 books on a Selectric typewriter. So that's what I remember.
Me too. And I've written at least 2 or 3 of them that way too. So, but again, let's get into the churches. You are, of course, founder and CEO of Church Answers, but there's a very troubling graph in your book that shows median worship attendance of churches in the U.S., and that's nothing that we haven't seen before. But there's also been sort of an uptick, some people have talked about, at least among some of the males in church. But by and large, churches have steadily declined over the last quarter century, haven't they?
They have declined, and I have been one of the more outspoken ones, getting attention to that decline. And it could seem like I'm a bit negative when doing so, but the news is negative. Now, I will add, it looks as if it's premature to make any kind of conclusion. It looks as if attendance in churches has bottomed out. The median is probably going to stay between 55 and 65, if not go up. But here's an amazing thing that is not in my book, but I'm beginning to see it already take place. Gen Z and Gen Alpha are beginning to try out the church, if you will.
Yes.
They're beginning to say, we want something from the church. And one of my theses in this book is, hey, let's get the anxious generation in church. Not because an institution is salvific, only Christ is salvific, but let's get them there where their minds can be shaped by the things of God instead of these awful things that they're getting on a screen.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a little bit more. One of the very interesting chapters is why the anxious generation doesn't go to church. And of course, I mentioned our little booklet here in which I was talking about the next generation, both Generation Y and Z, quoting your book and books by Jean Twenge and a variety of others. But I also talk about the idea that sometimes the churches and pastors make a mistake. I call it the field of dreams myth. If you build it, they will come. We've built 350,000 churches in America. They aren't coming, or the few that are only trying it out. So we need to talk about some of the attitudes of the unchurched and what we can do to reach out. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When the Supreme Court rules 9-0 on a case, you should pay attention. In this case, it is law enforcement that needs to pay attention. The High Court ruled that the federal government can be held accountable for a botched SWAT raid performed by the FBI. The SWAT team raid in question occurred during the middle of the night. Armed FBI agents in tactical gear deployed a flashbang grenade and held the couple at gunpoint before realizing they had the wrong address. The action was part of Operation Red Tape that was targeting gang activity in Georgia. Apparently, in the pre-raid drive-by, The team leader used his personal GPS and misidentified the home. It appears he failed to verify the street name and house number. The real target was a block away from the home that was breached by the FBI. 10 years ago, we started doing radio programs on how SWAT teams in military gear were crashing into homes erroneously. Frequently, the innocent victims of the raid are left with property damage and injuries that easily could have been shot, since the mother in this case raced to reach and comfort her 7-year-old daughter. When I first interviewed John Whitehead about this, he reported that some in law enforcement did not even know what the First Amendment prohibits in terms of unlawful searches and seizures. He lamented that the Constitution's safeguards against police abuse means nothing when government agents can crash through your door, terrorize your children, shoot your dogs, and jail you. Imagine if someone crashed through your front door at night. You might try to reach for your phone or perhaps even for a weapon. This is one botched SWAT raid that could end in your death. Fortunately, the Supreme Court ruled correctly in this case. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about this book coming out, and I would encourage you to pre-order it, as I will be doing as well. The Anxious Generation Goes to Church, what the research says about what younger generations need and want from your church. And, of course, talking with Thom Rainer. And Dr. Thom Rainer, let's, if we can, talk about why the anxious generation doesn't go to church. We have the descriptions of the unchurched, the unaffiliated, the nuns, and a variety of others. But whatever category you want to use, there are some very good reasons why they don't go to church, and it, I think, illustrates again what we need to do to be more welcoming and to provide an alternative.
There are a lot of reasons that they give, and probably one of the more comprehensive surveys was done by Ryan Burge, who serves adjunctively on our team at Church Answers. And he and another researcher just simply asked the question of the nuns. That means those who have no particular religious affiliation, why you don't go to church. And it's what you would expect. Things like hypocrisy. It doesn't make sense. We think Christians or religious people are bigots. Harm caused by religion in the world. And yes, those are first-level answers. And when I talked to Ryan about this, he said, well, I understand this is how they're going to respond immediately to these type of surveys. But here is an underlying issue that perhaps we need to begin to uncover more and more, and that is this generation has a lot of reasons why they say they don't go to church. And we can do a lot of dumb things, Kerby, when people come to our churches, and we can be unfriendly, we can be unwelcoming, we can be foreign to them, and those things do need to be taken care of. But here's what we're finding more and more. The anxious generation, we're talking mainly about Gen Z, but maybe some Gen Alpha, they want something that church has to offer. And what church has to offer is the idea that someone cares for me and someone invites me. It is that simple.
Yes.
We have done study after study that when you invite someone to church and actually take them into church, not just a loose invitation and say, come when you can, but you actually take them in, the acceptance rate is now approaching 80% as we deal with these younger generations. Imagine what could happen if we cared enough to bring them into the church despite all of our faux pas and mistakes that we make that cause these reasons like hypocrisy and bigotry, and we can say we care enough for you not only to invite you, but to bring you to church with us. They are amazingly receptive. That's some of the best news that I have researched in years.
I might just mention that, of course, at Church Answers, you've developed this ministry called Invite Your One. My own Southern Baptist church that I attend, we use the Invite Your One, and it does seem to me that not a general call, but wouldn't you come with us, or here we will break the ice, and I think that is important. So that brings us then to, and I want you as a pastor speaking to other pastors and maybe youth leaders and others listening right now, when the anxious generation goes to church, what are they looking for, and how can we begin to be more welcoming, provide positive role models, and provide some opportunities for them to actually connect?
The anxious generation, like many of the predecessor generations, they want to see real people. They want to see genuine people. They do not want to see religious people going through Pharisaic motions. They can smell that a mile away, and so they understand when there's a genuine desire for someone to be there and to care for them. They want them to speak to them, and that a kind of a problem that many churches do not have, just not even speaking to them. They want them to be welcome, and they want to go to a place where they don't feel intimidated. And though we don't dumb down the sermons, and though we don't dumb down the teaching, at least explain in a way that a typical church member could understand, so a typical unchurched person could understand too. A welcoming church is key, Kerby, and it is not the most complicated thing in the world. It is something that we could do immediately with some intentionality. So I would say to pastors, what do you need to do for your church to become a welcoming church? What needs to happen? And those are not just rhetorical questions. I wish they would answer them specifically. And there are a number of things we could get into. A lot of ways you can become more welcoming for any generation, but particularly for the anxious generation, because here's what we know. They are going to come back to some churches, and they may be coming back to your church. And the question is, will we be ready for them? Will we care for them? Will we love them? Will we not do some of the dumb things that we've done in the past? And will we be ready for them to come into our worship centers and our sanctuaries?
Let me just mention again, the book is entitled The Anxious Generation Goes to Church. And, of course, you could get into all the specific aspects. I only have a few more minutes with you, I know, but it does seem to me that that's why I think a pastor or a youth leader or somebody that is really concerned about church growth would want to get this book. But let's get back to the title, because you do have a section on the antidote to anxiety. It does seem to me that this is a generation saying, I'm anxious, I'm depressed. We've seen the level of suicide ideation going up. They recognize that they have some problems. They're just not convinced that the church has the answer to those problems. They're not necessarily convinced that Jesus or even the Bible has answers to those problems. And so in some respects, that antidote to anxiety is really key, isn't it?
It is key, and the church has that key. Imagine someone with a screen in front of their face 16 hours a day, and they walk into a worship center, and they hear the praise music, the hymns. They watch people sing along. Perhaps they do as well. They watch a pastor read a scriptural text and then explain it in a true biblical context. And all that time, what is going in their mind are things that have never gone in their mind before. What has gone in their mind are all the evils that have come through internet, social media, and the polarized world in which we live. And now they're walking to a church. Well, what are they absorbing? They're absorbing prayer. They're absorbing the Word. They're absorbing praise. They're absorbing those things that are just the opposite of what the anxious generation has been getting on their smartphone. And they immediately, many times, they will say, what's going on here? Why have I not heard this? Why have I not thought about this? And so the church has the antidotes. Christ has the antidotes. And again, I hope I'm not oversimplifying it, but if we can just get our people inviting others to come to church and actually go with them into the building, maybe take them to lunch afterwards, if we can do that and they come into our church, we can just let the Holy Spirit do His work, and their minds will be reshaped by the things of God that have been so maligned and badly shaped by the things of the world and by the things of the evil one.
You know, the other part of that is they're not only getting the positive aspect, they may be even getting some admonition against the negative, and that is there are pastors that are willing to say, you know, maybe you need to reduce screen time, and you've got a section there, garbage out, goodness in, and it seems to me that, again, if you're not putting in all the garbage into your brain, and you aren't necessarily living by the standards of the world, and you're following Romans 12:1 and 2, it does seem to me that that's working as well. But just before I run out of time with you, we do have a link to churchanswers.com. And first of all, we have a link to the book, even though it's not out, and you should be looking for it in your local bookstore next month. But if you want to pre-order it, as many of us are going to do, I've got, of course, an advanced reader's copy. We've made that easy. But if people go to Church Answers, they may be looking for other material besides this book, and you've just got an incredible amount of resource there for churches that really want to have a dynamic ministry in their community.
Thank you for giving that information out. And we love the local church. We believe in the local church. We know that the local church is not perfect because it has imperfect people just like me. But we love pastors, and we love the local church, and that's why we're not very complicated. We try to provide answers for churches. So what's our name? Church Answers, and we will continue to do that because we love the local church.
Yeah, and a great resource. And again, it's churchanswers.com. The anxious generation goes to church. What the research says about what younger generations need and want from their church. Again, I will mention that some of the other resources, and I'll just hold up another Thom Rainer book here, this one on the millennials that he wrote with his son, I think are just some resources that if you want to have an outreach to the next generation, those are resources I would recommend. I've also held up our little booklet here. I make that free of charge, so if you haven't already obtained a copy of that, we send this out one each month, and that particular topic relates very much to some of this material, but we really encourage you to make a difference in the local church. And so, Thom, thank you for writing this book, and I look forward to when it comes out, and I encourage people to get a copy.
Oh, it's been an honor. Thank you.
Going to take a break. When we come back, I've got a few things in the news to talk about. And matter of fact, I always like to talk about one-year anniversaries, and we've got today a one-year anniversary. Maybe you figure out what it is. If not, you can join us after the break, because there are some really interesting things that have unfolded in the last 365 days, so we'll get into that as well. Posted a lot of articles that we will try to get into, but if not, we certainly will cover much more throughout this entire week. Let's take a break. We'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. If you would like to join us a little bit later, we'll open up the phones, but let me just do one of those. If you aren't aware, this is the 1-year anniversary of what, you might say. 1 year ago, on July 21st, 2024, President Joe Biden announced his withdrawal from the 2024 presidential race. You know, the other day when we had Penna Dexter in here, and I guess it was Dr. Merrill Matthews or whoever it was, we were talking about the fact that at that time we were talking, and maybe I guess it was Kelly Shackelford, because that goes back a couple of weeks ago, when it was 1 year anniversary since the rather difficult debate experience that he had. And we thought, my goodness, how much has happened in a year? If you're like me, the older you get, the years just zoom by. But every once in a while, they tend to be a little bit slower, and that is to think that it was this time just a year ago that we finally knew that Joe Biden was not going to run. Then you have, of course, the issue of Kamala Harris. You have the election. Then you have even the election, and then finally the inauguration of Donald Trump. And then you've had this blur of 6 months. And again, Penna on Friday mentioned the piece by Mark Thiessen on Washington Post, which I've heard other people mention, kind of just giving you a quick catalog of some of the incredible successes that have happened in the last 6 months. But anyway, if you haven't been paying attention, it was this time a year ago when the President of the United States withdrew. There are only a few of the times you've had something like that happen. There was an announcement back in 1968 when you had Lyndon Johnson say that he was going to withdraw from seeking another term. But again, it's pretty unusual in American history. And 1 year ago today. Let's get into some of the issues in the news, though, because while we're talking about Democrats, Beckett Adams calls this Democratic spokesman have the easiest job in America. He's having a little bit of fun, actually, because what he's really talking about is the incredible media bias that is starting to surface over the issue of the auto pen. Now, we've talked about this on a number of occasions. A couple of weeks ago, you had Dr. Merrill Matthews write a very good piece on the auto pen, and I still think it's one of the best. I just recently was interacting with somebody and pointed to his piece, and then he has a link to the original article in the New York Times. And as we mentioned the other day, it's worth mentioning again that we have, for those of you that are especially younger, we have never had a president use an auto pen in an official capacity. And we now can document, because this is documented in an article that appeared in the New York Times, that the very first time an auto pen was used to sign a bill was when President Barack Obama, so that takes us back quite a number of years, doesn't it? When President Barack Obama, I think it was in 2011, actually was out of country and ordered that an auto pen sign the reauthorization of the Patriot Act. I wish they just let it go, because that turned out to be such a disaster, as we well know. But nevertheless, the first time any sort of official auto pen was used, other than, of course, signing of some various things that were made to look somewhat like the president signed a thank you note or a special picture or something like that. But anything that had any sort of official significance, whether it was, in this case, a bill, or now just the enormous number of pardons, all of that goes all the way back to Barack Obama. But the point that Beckett Adams is making is that one of the easiest jobs in the world right now is to be a Democratic spokesman, because he says it doesn't, this individual, he doesn't even need to get out of bed in the morning because the press is already hard at work for him. And he says, consider, for example, the particularly embarrassing attempt last week by NBC News to downplay concerns surrounding the Biden administration's record-breaking number of pardons and commutations, and questions about who was actually in charge when the woman operating the auto pen received final approvals. While some questions whether this was an unauthorized and unsupervised exercise of an exclusive and narrowly defined presidential power, the Peacock Network, that'd be NBC, had answers by comparing this story to the fact that a member of Congress doing an investigation actually uses an e-signature on some of the PDFs. I'm not making this up. This is how bad it's gotten. He says, as idiotic as it sounds, Democrats really couldn't hope for a more friendly news crew. And that is the particular article that comes from NBC's Ryan Nobles and Melanie Zanora, is that Representative James Comer, we've talked about him before. James Comer is the representative from the state of Kentucky and heads up the Oversight Committee, has been leading the probe into Joe Biden's cognitive state during the presidency, so the article says, with Republicans alleging that Biden's occasional use of the auto pen to sign documents, a practice as other presidents have done as well. And again, that's where I think it's a little bit dishonest, but okay. Demonstrate he wasn't fully in control or aware of his administration was doing. And they said, but it turns out, they say, the documents show that some of the letters or even the subpoena notices that James Comer has sent out in conjunction with his investigation have been signed using a digital signature, not written by the congressman himself. Now, have you ever signed a document? I think if you have, for a loan or for a bank issue or whatever, you know how you kind of sign it a little bit and then it creates you an e-sign. And they're comparing that little glip thing that you put sometimes to show that you have signed it to the auto pen, which was actually signed when Joe Biden wasn't even there. And there is a difference, I'd have to say, between having that e-signature on your email and signing theoretically, through an auto pen, a pardon from individuals that are certainly questionable in terms of whether or not they even deserve that pardon. But again, he says, so that we're on the same page, it is NBC's position that a representative signing a document with an e-signature is comparable to an auto pen being used, potentially unauthorized, by White House staffers to exercise an extraordinary and constitutionally enumerated power of presidential pardon. And again, the New York Times reported last week that Mr. Biden did not individually approve each name for these pardons, but it just applied to a large number of people. If you follow the New York Times article, and I'll cut to the chase, it's where you have the attorneys, Ed Siskel and Jeffrey Zentz, in which they finally say, okay, these are the people we're going to pardon. They send, now that they have the email, they send the email, and 3 minutes later, then you get this, I approve the use of AutoPen for the execution of all of the following pardons. It probably takes more than 3 minutes to read through this exhaustive list of pardons. But just as we go to a break here, let me just give you a couple of illustrations. Who were some of the people that Joe Biden pardoned? One is former Judge Michael Conan, who accepted bribes in return for sending minors to for-profit detention centers. Rita Credwell, who embezzled a dazzling $53 million from the city of Dixon, Illinois. We talked about her before. You have various tax frauders, and I won't even give you the whole set of there. James Burkhart, a con man who targeted nursing homes. Gerald Lundgren, who is convicted in 2019 of donating illegally to his daughter's doom campaign against Kentucky Republican Senator Mitch McConnell. You have an activist, Leonard Peltier, who actually murdered 2 FBI agents. You have Adrian Peeler, who was convicted in 1999 of a double homicide of a Connecticut mother and her 8-year-old son. And it was so brutal that it inspired the state to create its own witness protection program, and on and on and on. Of course, Joe Biden also pardoned 3 of his siblings and 2 of his in-laws, and on and on and on. And so when you get to this whole issue, just if nothing else, the sheer number of commutations and pardons coupled with this, what some people call this intense game of telephone played by the Biden White House, certainly, don't you think, demands and merits some scrutiny? And that's kind of the argument. But the point that Beckett Adams is making is, Democrats don't even have to defend themselves because the press is doing it for them. And Biden doesn't have to defend himself because the press is doing it for him and his handlers. And, of course, there is a quote in here where you have President Biden arguing that he individually approved any one and every one of these particular commutations and pardons. And let's face reality. Let's just be honest for a minute. There is no evidence that indeed was the case. But the saga of the auto pen continues. And one of the most interesting examples is the incredible media bias to defend now a no longer sitting president. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Next hour, we'll get into some more issues in the news. But one of the things we talked about is AutoPen. If you were listening last Monday, you might remember that we talked about the Scopes trial. And we had in studio a guest who, interestingly enough, had done his doctoral dissertation on William Jennings Bryan and had a whole section in his doctoral dissertation on the Scopes trial. So I thought it was really appropriate for you to know know that 100 years ago at this time, we had the so-called Scopes monkey trial. And so though we covered it, I saw this very good editorial, and we've posted it on the website by Walker Wildman. Walker Wildman is the son of Tim Wildman and has his own program on American Family Radio. But this particular piece is entitled 100 Years After Scopes, the Trial That Changed the Culture. And I thought you would like to know a little bit more about what he had to say, because even though we were kind of giving you the details, I think Walker's done a good job of giving us kind of the overview. And he says, July marks the 100th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial, and he calls it a pivotal moment in American history that reverberates far beyond the courtroom there in Dayton, Tennessee. And he points out the fact that it's oftentimes portrayed as a clash between science and faith, or between rational people and fundamentalist Christians or whatever. But he says it has been perceived as a flashpoint in the cultural and legal battle over the soul of a nation. And he says, in some respects, 100 years later, its legacy reminds us that truth matters, law shapes culture, and silence is surrender. He gives a little bit of the background. Of course, you're familiar with it, but I'll give it to you again. John T. Scopes, high school teacher. As we pointed out, again, Walker doesn't get into this. It's even doubtful as to whether or not he actually taught this, but since they were looking for somebody who wanted to challenge Tennessee's what was called Butler Act, he certainly volunteered to do that. And so then you brought in kind of these two titans. One of those was the three-time presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who was a famed orator. He was known as the commoner because he was often able to take really complex ideas sometimes and help the common man to understand them. And so on the one hand, you had William Jennings Bryan, who was wanting to support the law, the Butler Act. And then you had Clarence Darrow, who, of course, was a very famous lawyer on his own right, and, of course, had worked with this group that was looking to get some more visibility, which was the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And so basically, Scopes was actually being tried, but very quickly what they decided, so that in some respects William Jennings Bryan couldn't give his closing argument, nor could he cross-examine Clarence Darrow, which is what he wanted to do. They then just had Scopes claim he was guilty and fined $100. And of course, later the verdict was overturned. And as we pointed out, William Jennings Bryan then, for a while, traveled to actually give his closing comments, but then he died in his sleep. And then we had all sorts of revisionists say, well, he was embarrassed by what took place, and as a result, he just died of a broken heart, and on and on. And so you get all sorts of stories that weren't actually true to the story itself. But back to the point that I think Walker Wildman is making, which I think is right on target, and he says the Scopes trial really marked a defining moment when, he says, the elite class began openly mocking biblical Christianity and treating traditional values as backwards relics of a less enlightened time. And that works pretty well because it was actually in the courtroom there in Dayton, Tennessee. And so it allowed for this idea of really to be kind of the theater, as he says, for the Cultural Revolution. He says many look back on the trial as a loss to creationists. From a biblical worldview, the real loss was not legal, it was cultural. And that is, it began to show that the nation, even by then, was beginning to move away from biblical ideas. The universities already had moved in that direction. The law firms had started moving from that area as well. Some of the seminaries started to. This is when you had what was oftentimes known as the fundamentalist modernist controversy. So it was a time of a cultural shift. And again, 1925, and now we're in 2025, is a long time ago. But if you wanted to see a watershed, that certainly was one of those. He also goes on to say that there were some legal implications as well. because once you had that decision, there seemed to be a greater belief that you could remove God from the classroom, you could remove God from the public sphere. And you've heard Kelly Shackelford say we have lost a great deal of religious liberty, and only now in 2024 and 2025 do we have the kind of religious liberty we had maybe 100 years ago, because you have all sorts of decisions. You have Engel versus Vitale, which was in 1962, removing prayer from the public schools, Abington versus Shem, removing Bible reading in the schools. Of course, we've talked about just the other day the idea that you couldn't post the Ten Commandments, Stone versus Graham. You had Edwards versus Aguilar, which was a case out of Louisiana. You have the other one, the so-called Arkansas case, which basically said you could not teach. Not only could you not teach creation, you can't even teach intelligent design. Matter of fact, you can't even really provide an honest critique of evolution itself. And so, as he points out, the courts have become the battleground, not just for legal doctrine, but for our moral foundations. So he makes the case that that's why a 100-year anniversary of Scopes trial is more than just a historic marker. It's a rallying cry, he says. It's a reminder that culture is never neutral, and neither is the law. The courtroom, the classroom, the Capitol are all arenas where worldviews compete, and the Scopes trial reminds us what happens when the biblical worldview is relegated to the sidelines. And so he actually ends by saying, let us remember Dayton, not just as a courtroom drama, but as a call to engage, to defend, and to proclaim the truth that is in the beginning God created. Well, of course, we've talked about this quite often here on Point of View, and we'll continue to do so. So one of the reasons I encourage you to support Point of View and to support organizations like American Family Association is because they're in the battle. One of the things we want to try to do, though, is equip you to be in the battle rather than just pay us to go fight the battles. And certainly you have to do that with a Kelly Shackelford because you're not going to go into a courtroom. We want to give you books and booklets and Outlook magazine articles and everything to equip you to make a difference. Yeah, you may not necessarily be in a public forum, but you have friends, neighbors, coworkers, children, and grandchildren. They need to know the truth, and we want to equip you. That's why we see you as partners to this process, and certainly want to encourage you to join with us in that regard. Let me just, as a program note, mention that tomorrow I'm going to be flying to Alaska, and we will be up there meeting some of you that are partners, but also on this coming Thursday, that will be July 24th, we are doing a live broadcast from KJNP right there in North Pole, Alaska. So if you are in that region and would want to join us, I've heard of a few people that will be there to watch the live remote broadcast. I certainly want to hear from you. But also, if you want to stay, we're going to provide food. And again, I'll have to say KJNP is providing the food. And I'll say we as a collective group of individuals and would love to have some time to chat with you, get to know you and the rest. So again, if you haven't already signed up, your RSVP is very simple. 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. And we'll be back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's, if we can, talk about what is really kind of one of the biggest stories. And I was going to try to cover it in the first hour, and I thought I really need some time to break this down, because in some respects, if I just tried to rush it through in the segment that I had, it wasn't going to be fair enough to you, because I want to give you both sides of a story that right now has been pretty significant and maybe even groundbreaking, or maybe much to do about nothing. I tend to think that maybe that second may be true. And you might say, what are you talking about? Okay, we go off the air Friday. Right after that, you then have all the stories of the Director of National Intelligence. That would be Tulsi Gabbard, who then actually makes the very strong claim that indeed what we have is a series of email communications which just prove that even though individuals, including President Barack Obama and the people surrounding him, knew that there was no Russian collusion, they decided to go with that anyway to cripple. Of course, first they were talking about the candidate, now the president, the incoming president. And as you well know, in 2018, we were still dealing with the so-called Russiagate. And so in some respects, from 2016 to at least 2018, this Russia story was there. And if that is not enough, she also said that this was treasonous. And so you've got to really kind of address this issue. So I was thinking, okay, how do we cover this on Monday? And I came across this piece by Kevin McCullough, who I think buys into everything that Tulsi Gabbard had to say. And I thought, well, yes, but there are some people that are raising some, I think, very legitimate questions about what she said. And only this morning did I find this piece by Andrew McCarthy. So one of those is posted, but I'll mention the other one so that you get a full understanding of what is taking place. But let's go, first of all, to the piece by Kevin McCarthy. By Kevin McCullough. Actually, it's interesting. I got Andrew McCarthy and Kevin McCullough. And so, nevertheless, that is basically our second article, in which basically just says, well, the leftists trust the people. And he said from the first day that Joe Biden took office, there was a theme that you could spot a mile away. The left doesn't trust the American people. And he really spends some time talking about the auto pen. And I thought that was a good follow-up, since we just have talked about the auto pen, in which President Biden supposedly signed something important but never touched the pen. But it was just a glitch in the optics. So he starts by talking about something we've already discussed, the auto pen, and that was the piece by Beckett Adams. Now he spends the rest of the article talking about the issue of the Russian collusion. And he says, we now know without conjecture or spin, I'm not so sure I want to say that as dogmatically as he does, that the so-called Russia collusion narrative of 2016 was a top-down White House engineered fabrication, not a misunderstanding, not a misfire, a deliberate operation to undermine the legitimacy of a duly elected president to suppress the will of over 62 million Americans who voted for him. Now, most of that's true, but I just wouldn't say it quite as strongly as he says. And he says that basically we go back to a meeting which President Barack Obama held on December 9th, 2016, which had Comer, Clapper, Brennan, Rice. They were all present. And from that meeting came the marching orders to produce a new intelligence assessment. Quite frankly, I think some of that is indeed what was taking place. But here's the issue. They manufactured with what I think could be referred to as high confidence that Russia interfered with the specific intent of helping Trump win. That's where I would disagree, but let me get to the rest of what he writes before I give you a perspective that I think makes more sense in light of the data. And so he then goes on and talks about this announcement that came out on Friday. Current Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has now said it out loud. What she called it was a treasonous conspiracy. Those are her words, he says. And she hasn't just said it, she's referred the matter to the Department of Justice for further investigation. All proper in terms of whether or not what we have in some of these emails and others constitute a further investigation. And again, one of the things I do appreciate about Kevin McCullough is he tries to put this in perspective. He said, this isn't about relitigating 2016. This is about exposing the rot that exists when one political class believes it has the divine right to overturn or override the will of the American people. He goes on to talk about how we see that sometimes taking place. He says, this is not democracy. It's not a republic. It's ruled by ruling class. And so in some respects, he says, we've reached the point where the intelligence community, the media, and parts of our justice system are no longer neutral actors. You've heard Kelly Shackelford say this for some time on this program. And he says this isn't really about Donald Trump anymore. It's about trust and the American people's trust in their institutions being shattered on purpose. So, again, you can read all of this. I've summarized a 3-page commentary by Kevin McCullough, excuse me, I keep making that mistake, and you can read it for yourself. But now Andrew McCarthy has been saying that really this is an overstatement, and he begins by a really good question. Do Trump intelligence officials speak with each other? Does Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, read the reports generated by the Central Intelligence Agency? And he says there's a good reason to wonder. And why is that? Well, just a few days before this, the CIA director, that would be John Ratcliffe, he used to be a member of Congress here in Texas, then he was the Director of National Intelligence, so he knows a little bit about this. And here, the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, did issue an analytical report, which just a few days ago, in a sense, contradicts some of the implications of these really strong statements made by Tulsi Gabbard. And so I think we have already seen when we've talked about the Jeffrey Epstein affair, how sometimes there are people in the Trump administration that get out in front of their skis. They get out ahead of the data. They make some claims that maybe they later are forced to have to withdraw. And I think that's exactly what might be going on this time. And you might say, okay, well, Andrew McCarthy, what does he know? Well, first of all, he wrote a book on the subject called Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. So he recognized some of this was actually done nefariously. So he's not disagreeing with that. He has just recently put together, and you can find the link in which he has a 3-part Russiagate Revisited, and you have 3 different sections you can read. But when we come back from the break, I want to come back and maybe explain what was probably going on behind the scenes and how, of course, it is fair to say that these Obama officials used that, but was Russia involved? I think partially. Did they influence the election? No. But I think we have to maybe thread the needle between claims being made on both sides, and I'll try to do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When the Supreme Court rules 9-0 on a case, you should pay attention. In this case, it is law enforcement that needs to pay attention. The High Court ruled that the federal government can be held accountable for a botched SWAT raid performed by the FBI. The SWAT team raid in question occurred during the middle of the night. Armed FBI agents in tactical gear deployed a flashbang grenade and held the couple at gunpoint before realizing they had the wrong address. The action was part of Operation Red Tape that was targeting gang activity in Georgia. Apparently, in the pre-raid drive-by, the team leader used his personal GPS and misidentified the home. It appears he failed to verify the street name and house number. The real target was a block away from the home that was breached by the FBI. 10 years ago, we started doing radio programs on how SWAT teams in military gear were crashing into homes erroneously. Frequently, the innocent victims of the raid are left with property damage and injuries that easily could have been shot, since the mother in this case raced to reach and comfort her 7-year-old daughter. When I first interviewed John Whitehead about this, he reported that some in law enforcement did not even know what the First Amendment prohibits in terms of unlawful searches and seizures. He lamented that the Constitution's safeguards against police abuse means nothing when government agents can crash through your door, terrorize your children, shoot your dogs, and jail you. Imagine if someone crashed through your front door at night. You might try to reach for your phone or perhaps even for a weapon. This is one botched SWAT raid that could end in your death. Fortunately, the Supreme Court ruled correctly in this case. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Again, it's sometimes difficult to even think about going all the way back to 2016, all the way up to 2018, and even talk about the so-called Russia collusion issue. We've talked about it on this program many times before, but it is, I think, helpful to realize that the more facts we have, you can eliminate both extreme positions. And that, in some respects, is oftentimes the truth that we find even as we're in the midst of a scandal. Was it true that Russia tried to have some influence in the election of 2016? Yes. But I think it'll surprise you to find out what they were trying to do. So, on the one hand, when you have some individuals, especially those who supported Donald Trump, saying there was no evidence of Russia collusion, well, that's not quite true, because there were some attempts, rather feeble, rather insignificant, but don't say there was no, because we do have that evidence. On the other hand, you have, of course, those who are convinced that Hillary Clinton should have won if it weren't for the fact that the Russians were involved. And now we know enough to know that both of those particular arguments were not true. And so, first of all, let's recognize that some of the claims that you're going to hear and have heard from Tulsi Gabbard are based upon emails, many of which we already have access to. So how can you thread the needle between saying, okay, Russia had maybe some influence, but it didn't affect the election, And it turns out that if you really dig a little bit into this, and Andrew McCarthy, written a book on it, written 3 very significant articles on it, so I'm going to try to summarize a lot, hopefully not to be too simplistic. But argument number 1 is, yes, it is true that Russia sought to have some kind of influence in the 2016 election between, of course, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But they did so, number 2, in order to affect Hillary Clinton. In other words, there seems to now be pretty good evidence that Vladimir Putin and other people in Russia anticipated that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Let's go back to 2016. You remember how many times people said it looks pretty obvious that Hillary Clinton's going to be the next president of the United States. And then remember the shock on the faces of a lot of people in the Clinton campaign that night when that actually did not take place, and the shock even in the mainstream media. So Russia thought that Hillary Clinton would be the next president. And so in some respects, their influence, if it was to try to harm in some way, in a number of different ways, Hillary Clinton, so that once she was elected, she would be a less effective president, and that would be in the best interest of Russia. Well, once you figure that out, and I recognize that maybe for some of you listeners, you're going, I have never heard that before. But again, even though we didn't post the piece by Andrew McCarthy, you can easily find it. You can find his book in a bookstore. You can find some of the articles. You will see that. And so now you can see why Andrew McCarthy says, the Democrats complaining that Russia stole the election from Clinton was nonsense, because the Russians assumed she was going to win. They just wanted to do what little harm they could do in order to perhaps have some kind of impact. And the impact that they did have was pretty insignificant, but there are some particular pieces of evidence that maybe they tried to have some influence on the infrastructure and posted a couple of other issues, but the inference was not much. And of course, now we have basically all sorts of declassified information that we didn't have a number of years ago. So again, you can see the impact that would have had. And again, also then is where he not only points out that the particular report, which comes from John Ratcliffe, who's the CIA director, which I believe does contradict the statements in part by the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. He then goes on and has a few questions even about that report. So you can take it for what it is, but all I'm trying to help you understand is that there is seemingly a tendency for some individuals in the Trump administration who like to maybe get good press and like to call attention to themselves. And let's face it, when you're talking about ambitious women, Pam Bondi and Tulsi Gabbard certainly fit into that category. I've never met Tulsi Gabbard. Kelly Shackelford has, and I sort of formed an opinion about her. And then after Kelly told me some of the conversations he's had with her, I said, okay, it is certainly newsworthy that you can refer to some of these actions by the previous administration as treasonous, but now comes the need to prove it. And I think that just illustrates once again that if you are going to be a wise and discerning consumer of news and information, check it out. Look for more than one source. I apologize I haven't posted the one by Andrew McCarthy, but just go to National Review. You can find it for yourself. Or again, like I said, find his book in a bookstore, find some of his articles he's posted recently, and he will take you to school on some of those issues. And in that vein, I thought I would also illustrate once again, just because you see it in the news doesn't mean it's true. And this one came, interestingly enough, on a news program, but I'm fortunate that at least the Friday edition that our good friend Gary Bauer posted, he gives me some of the facts that I was starting to become aware of. And for those of you that have been watching the news, you might remember that there was a press conference in Los Angeles in which the immigration attorney was claiming that his client, this mother, a mother of three, was kidnapped by immigration police in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. Now, again, if you are a news consumer, you remember how this was really of concern. And the lawyer actually alleged that the immigration agents traumatized her, punished her, and then set up a GoFundMe page to help pay for her bills. Now, we know the rest of the story. I saw on Laura Ingraham an interview they did with somebody with the Immigration Service who said, we knew we did not have this woman. We knew that claiming that we kidnapped her was wrong, but we started our investigation because we assumed she was kidnapped. In other words, we knew she was not in custody. She was not in any detention area. And so maybe indeed she was kidnapped, but they blamed us. So, first of all, you have the police in Los Angeles launched an investigation. Homeland Security launched an investigation knowing full well they didn't have her, but they certainly couldn't figure out where she might be. And of course, then if you watch some of these programs, MSNBC, CNN, the attorney for the woman, he was basically a fixture on all the major networks. Okay. What's the rest of the story? You're waiting for that. Remember Paul Harvey used to say, now the rest of the story. Now, after the media pushed that narrative against the immigration police, a narrative that I think was intended to move public opinion, turns out nobody was actually going to kidnap her. She was in the country illegally and actually used the scam. She just went into hiding, used the scam to raise money to pay her legal fees. And her immigration authority, an attorney, seems to have been in on the scam. Now, when I first watched that on Laura Ingraham, we were pretty sure that the woman was in on the scam. Maybe the daughter was in on the scam. We weren't sure about the attorney, but now it looks like the immigration attorney was in on the scam. And also turned out the entire community, Hispanic community, turned out against the federal immigration individuals. And yet, like I said, I heard about it first and saw it first on Laura Ingraham. I now have it documented here for our good friend Gary Bauer. But Gary Bauer then ends the piece by saying there's been a virtual media blackout on the truth of what really happened. One of the concerns I have, even apart from media bias, is the fact that oftentimes they'll run with a story and then later never come back to the story. And of course, if you already have a bias against the Trump administration, a bias against immigration deportation, the chances that they will come back to that story, slim and none. Once again, don't trust the first thing you see. Again, recognize that there's some real value in checking some sources. And this one took the better part of a couple of weeks, almost a month, to find the real truth behind the story. When they prosecute the woman, this daughter, and the immigration attorney, maybe we'll hear about it. Probably not. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net, click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that we will be broadcasting from Alaska on Thursday. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. Penna Dexter will be here Wednesday, and so it gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going to happen this week. But real quickly, let me point you to the commentary for today, which I actually have picked up because I think it is, again, another great illustration of the fact that on many of these cases, they're not that controversial. This was another one of those 9-0 cases. And Karen, just in order to have some fun, has a picture where it says breaking news, and it shows all 9 of the justices agreeing. But I think we recognize that sometimes we've had some 6-3 decisions and 5-4 decisions, but there have been a number of 9-0 decisions, and this is one. And I said that when the Supreme Court rules 9-0, you probably better pay attention. And in this case, law enforcement needs to pay attention because it has to do with the fact that the Supreme Court has made it very clear that the federal government can be held accountable for a botched SWAT raid performed by the FBI. The SWAT team raid in particular took place during the middle of the night. FBI agents show up in tactical gear, deployed a flashbang grenade, held the couple at gunpoint before finally realizing it was the wrong address. For those of you in the state of Georgia, this was part of what was called Operation Red Tape that was targeting gang activity in Georgia. And before a raid takes place, there's oftentimes a pre-raid drive-by. And the team leader used his personal GPS, but he misidentified the house and failed to verify both the street name and the house number. The real target was a block away, so they missed it by a bunch. And 10 years ago, I started doing commentaries on this based upon some interviews we did with John Whitehead. John Whitehead has really been concerned about the loss of civil liberties, and he has been critical of the Biden administration, before that even of the Obama administration, and more recently very critical of some things in the Trump administration. But back 10 years ago, we were talking primarily what was happening under Barack Obama. And I remember even doing some concerns about some of these SWAT teams and military gear, and then starting to see some of the people saying, boy, Kerby Anderson sounds like President Barack Obama. You know, he doesn't seem to like the police. And I kept trying to explain, I support the police, but doesn't mean I have to support everything police do. And then, of course, then you have the defund the police and everything else that came from that. But again, we were covering this story 10 years ago. That's 2015 when we were covering this, in which at the time we were seeing there were innocent victims. They were oftentimes left with property damage, sometimes injuries, because they come in with guns drawn. The mother in this particular case in Georgia raced to reach and comfort her 7-year-old daughter. They could have shot her. And we certainly recognize some of these concerns. And that's where even 10 years ago, back in 2015, John Whitehead was saying, you know, there are people sometimes in law enforcement that don't even know what the Fourth Amendment, I should say, prohibits in terms of unlawful searches and seizures. And at the time, he made a very strong comment, but I think it's, again, helpful to understand why you had 9 justices say that, yes, SWAT team raids can indeed be held accountable, because he made the statement, the Constitution's safeguards against police abuse means nothing when government agents can crash through your door, terrorize your children, shoot your dogs, and jail you. And so, again, you can just go through this and imagine if you were an individual that were innocently confronted by SWAT team. I mean, you might have reached for your phone. You might have reached for a weapon. I mean, this could end in the loss of life, and there have been some incredible tragedies. And there is a good example of one that went all the way up to the high court. And fortunately, the Supreme Court ruled correctly in that regard. So I thought I would mention that as one of those concerns that we were trying to identify as much as 10 years ago. But let me come to one of the second to the last articles I've posted, and this one is by Tudor Dixon. Some of you in the state of Michigan may know her because she was a gubernatorial nominee and an individual that is actually the host of the Tudor Dixon podcast. Anyway, she entitles this, "The True Cost of Today's Free Public Education." In some respects, it brings us back to the comments we heard just a few minutes ago from Walker Wildman. Originally, I kind of had the two together because I thought they might be kind of helpful. But nevertheless, she says, "My children go to a Christian school. I love the middle school, but sometimes I'm afraid my girls miss out on high school because the high school where she goes doesn't have a sports program like the local public school does. And so the case, there's really no Friday night lights at the Christian high school in Western Michigan. My kids don't have a fancy homecoming dance in the fall. And even the offering of advanced placement classes are limited." And so she really acknowledges that there are times when you put your kids in a Christian school, and there's a bit of a sacrifice. I've mentioned before, my producer has taught at a Christian school, and my kids went to Christian school, although some of them later on went into the public schools later on. But she says even though they don't have some of those things, they do have a Bible class, and they actually have a chance to learn some of those issues. And so nevertheless, she says, as we talked about just a week or two ago, the National Education Association held its annual convention in Portland, and the Teacher of the Year talked about, "Once I realized how deeply political our profession has always been, I knew I could no longer stay on the sidelines." And so all of a sudden, this is where Tudor Dixon says, we're just not just talking about trying to teach kids reading, writing, history, and math. Those shouldn't be political, but they are being injected with radical, she says, far-left ideology. And this is coming because, in some respects, some of the teachers' unions are seeing this as very appropriate. And then points out, as we did just about a week ago, that the NEA has cut ties with the Anti-Defamation League, in part because, well, the ADF or the ADL has actually spent a fair amount of time talking about anti-Semitism. And she says the decision on the part of the NEA, the National Education Association, of cutting ties from the ADL, that would be the Anti-Defamation League, means that probably any kind of teaching about anti-Semitism, maybe even teaching about the Holocaust, and the rest might just never actually take place again in some of these public schools. So she says, this leads me to my decision, certainly not having a chance to go to Friday night lights high school football games, not having very nice homecoming like you'd have in the public schools, doesn't outweigh some of the concerns I'm seeing beginning to generate once again into the public school system. And so she says, my children may not watch football games in the fall, but they do and will learn about eternal, unconditional love. They'll be taught to treat others the way they want to be treated, and they will certainly be encouraged to serve in the community. And he says, I pray for my 4 children to attend their schools, and each month I count my pennies carefully when it comes to the monthly bills just to be able to cover the cost of school. I could live much more comfortably if we used the public school system. I should still feel safe sending them there, but I can't anymore. The choice is easy when I ask myself if I prefer a cost to me or a permanent cost to them. She admits, I am a public school graduate. Always thought my kids would go to the public schools, but I'm recognizing I need to make the sacrifice to make sure they have a Christian education because they're meant to focus on their studies, not someone else's personal political ideology. My children are filled with love and learning and a lot less stress because the teachers who bring those values they have, and I'm grateful to them. It's a really powerful argument. I recognize those of you out there that have decided to put your kids in a Christian school or even decided to homeschool. There are some costs. We understand that. But this is just one more illustration from Tudor Dixon, who reminds us that it's not just the financial cost, which is quite a bit, but it's also the impact that it would have on your children. And if nothing else, just thought I would mention it because it is one more parent recognizing that it's expensive, but in the long run, it's worthwhile. So if we can encourage you to reconsider whether or not to have your kids in a Christian school or to homeschool your kids, I'm hoping that piece might be a way to encourage you to make that decision. Let's take a break, though. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes, let me just mention that tomorrow will be our Millennial Roundtable, and I think you will enjoy that conversation. Penna Dexter will be speaking on Wednesday and doing an interview in that first hour on biblical feminism and kind of getting into some of those issues, controversial issues. I think you'll appreciate that. Thursday, of course, a live broadcast we're doing from North Pole, Alaska, and then Friday, our weekend edition. And again, that week will just zip by, but one of the things I wanted to end with was this very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson. He's been on the program with us before. We quote from him quite often. And the other day, he kind of made a list of places where the various, if you will, experts were making mistakes, where they weren't necessarily giving us good information. I've actually turned that into a commentary, so next week you will hear that commentary. But nevertheless, let me also mention that this 4-page piece is kind of a short summary, and it shows us that if nothing else, the world woke up. Now, woke intended to be the idea, because he points out that in the last really 6 months, the entire world has been turned upside down. And what used to be conventional wisdom, or the status quo, is reversed. And he means that in a very positive way. Some of that which is unthinkable now, it's just pretty routine. And he gives us a couple of examples. So I'll just work my way through each one. And if you would like to read it in its entirety, it is the last article we've posted on our website at pointofview.net. But the first is, it says, first of all, take illegal immigration. He says, remember when we had 10,000 daily illegal entries under former President Joe Biden? He says, recall the only solution supposedly was we needed comprehensive immigration reform, which he says was a euphemism for mass amnesties. Now he says there's really no such thing as daily new illegal immigration. It simply disappeared with common sense enforcement of some of the existing immigration laws and a new president. You might remember the phrase that they said, well, we didn't need a new law, we just needed a new president. So on the issue of immigration, what was considered to be kind of conventional wisdom, even status quo, is very, very different. So then he moves from immigration to the military. We were, not so long ago, talking about a shortfall, are you ready for this, of about 40,000 up to almost 50,000 in terms of military recruitment. I mean, there were some people that were trying to suggest maybe we need to go back to a draft because this volunteer army wasn't working out. And, of course, the argument we were given from the so-called experts, the generals, was that they said, well, it's just difficult to enlist soldiers. We have generational gangs. We have the problem of obesity. We have the issue of drugs. And we just have a stiff competition with private industry. They can make more if they don't join the military. And then again, Victor Davis Hanson says, in just 6 months, recruitment targets are already met, and the issue is mostly moot. Now, why is that, he says? Well, the new Pentagon flipped the old, canceled its racist DEI programs and assured the rural middle-class Americans, especially white males, that they were not systemically racist after all. So then he moves from immigration to military to what about NATO? We were told about there would be a NATO crisis because of the fact that you have this bully, President Donald Trump. And yet now look at what we have. The vast majority, he says, of NATO members have met their pledges to spend 2% of GDP on defense, which will soon increase to 5%. Even talks about some of the neutrals like Sweden and Finland have become frontline NATO nations and things like that. So then what about, while we're talking about overseas, what about Iran? Remember that one? You know, we had this almost unassailable, all-powerful, indomitable, theocratic Iran, the scourge of the Middle East for the last 50 years. Even though, as he points out, it never won a war in the half century, but if nothing else, they are surrogates. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, they were too dangerous to provoke. He says, what are we dealing with now? He says, well, most of the expeditionary terrorists are neutered, and their leaders are in hiding or dead. Iran has no air force, no real navy, no air defenses, no active nuclear weapons program. Its safety apparently depends on the mood of the United States and Israel. They can now, and we have been able to fly over there with almost impunity. So, again, he's given us one after another, but I'll pick out maybe two more. What happened to this inevitable recession? I was watching some economic material just the other day in which why one individual saying we're not headed for a recession. He was talking about various yields and everything, and it's pretty technical, but nevertheless, we were supposed to be dealing with inevitable inflation, recession, hyperinflation, a collapse of the stock market, and all that. Again, Victor Davis Hanson said, well, job growth is strong. April's inflation rate is the lowest in 4 years. The GDP is steady. Stock market hit a record high. He doesn't mention here, but we've mentioned in previous commentaries that even the jobs reports, was it now 4 months in a row, have exceeded what the expectations were. And that's pretty significant. And again, what's the reason for that? He says, well, things like tax cuts, deregulation, drill, baby drill, energy policies that have been displacing Green New Deal strangulation, anywhere from $8 to $10 trillion in potential foreign investment that's been encouraged rather than deterred. And again, reminds us of that. And then since, of course, he is at Stanford at the Hoover Institute, he says, what about these university presidents that were, again, part of these marquee elite universities with all sorts of prestige and powerful alumni? Well, he says supposedly these brilliant university professors and presidents, many of them have had to resign in shame, and the public is caught on to the grant surcharge that they are actually dealing with. And a subset of that, of course, could be the idea that we no longer, for example, at an Ivy League school, University of Pennsylvania, allow biological men to dominate women's sports. And what was that all about? Well, he says the people woke up, woke intended. They're no longer afraid to state that sex is binary and biologically determined, and biological men who dominate women's sports are bullies, not heroes. And so I've skipped over a few. You can read it in its entirety, but the title of that is The World Woke Up. And I think it's just a good illustration, again, that things are changing, and much of that is for the better. Just before we run out of time, let me mention that the first hour we had Thom Rainer with us, Dr. Thom Rainer, and he wrote, of course, this book coming out in August, so you'll have to pre-order it right now if you'd like to get a copy, The Anxious Generation. But if you'd like a free booklet, let me hold this one up. This is the one that we put out about 2 years ago entitled A Biblical View on the Next Generation. And it's, again, one where I give you links to his book on the millennials, a book by Gene Twenge on, of course, the iGen generation. We'll probably update it and include his book and even the latest book by Jonathan Haidt and others, because if nothing else, we want to educate you and equip you to make a difference in your community, and in this case, in your own church. That's all we have for today. As always, want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Looking forward tomorrow to the Millennial Roundtable. Penna Dexter sitting in this chair on Wednesday, and then I'll be broadcasting live from Alaska on Thursday. We'll see you back here on Point of View tomorrow.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.